I was a kid, the Sega Genesis was the system for sports games. In particular, the Genesis had better football games than any other system. This was pretty well known by the mid-1990s. There were dozens of quality football games on the Genesis, all competing for the attention of sports gamers everywhere. And it's fascinating that the Sega Genesis came out on top like that, especially since Sega really screwed things up at the beginning. But to understand what happened and why, we've really got to turn back the clock, back to the mid-1980s in fact. This little chip might not look like much, but this was the source of frustration for video game designers for years. Nintendo's famous lockout chip made it so that the third-party game designers had to work directly with Nintendo to produce games for its best-selling console. This lockout chip basically served as a gatekeeper to prevent anybody who didn't have a direct working agreement with Nintendo from making games for its platform. And it also provided Nintendo with an easy way to make additional profits from the sale of third-party games for its system. The real kicker, of course, is that Nintendo could demand the companies only produce games for its console in order to get that famous Nintendo seal of quality. In other words, Nintendo was acting like the schoolyard bully. Now, Nintendo's chief competitor in the home console market was this baby, the Sega Master System. Unlike the NES, the Master System had no lockout chip, which theoretically should have made it more appealing to third-party game companies. However, the Master System wound up with a much smaller library of games than the NES, largely because the console itself was less popular. It's sort of a chicken and an egg problem when you think about it. You can't get good third-party game designers if you don't have high console sales, but you're not going to sell your consoles without having games that people actually want to play. Anyway, the Sega Master System was largely a failure for Sega, even though it did come out with some good football games. In hindsight, it's clear that the best football game of the mid-1980s was this one, XOR NFL Challenge. It might not look like much today, but it really was far ahead of the competition. If you look around, you'll find that some people praise this game, great football for the Sega Master System. But it's actually only a partially complete game. You take over a team in the fourth quarter down by an arbitrary score. You're on offense the entire time. To call a play, you push the button when the cursor is over the play you want. This is the most ridiculous play calling system of all time. And the players just stand there half the time. This game is anything but a classic. But believe it or not, this is still not the worst 8-bit football game of all time. John Elway's Quarterback came out that same year for the NES, 1987, and it's bad. Oh man, it's bad. Of course, it's still miles above NFL by LJN for the NES, a 1988 game that honestly should never have been released. In all seriousness, this might be the worst football video game of all time. Now, Sega countered this by releasing Walter Payton Football on the Master System in 1989. This game isn't perfect, sure, but it certainly is playable. There are some janky things, such as the ball being snapped the second you're out of the huddle. Overall, though, it's actually fun. At least it actually resembles football. Anyway, that kind of gives you an idea of what football games were like going into 1990. While it's easy for us to compare everything to really amazing games like Tecmo Super Bowl, the truth is that Tecmo's famous NES game really was a major outlier. The NES version of Tecmo Bowl came out in 1989, of course. It was clearly the best NES football game of the time. I mean, no other game was even close to this. But there still was room in the market for a newcomer. Aside from Tecmo Bowl, every other football game was largely a disappointment, and that's where Sega comes in. Sega's Mega Drive came out in Japan in 1988, and it was largely a failure in Japan. This was in part because it was released only a week after Nintendo's release of Mario 3 for the Famicom. Actually, the Mega Drive never really rose to the level of the PC Engine or the Famicom or eventually the Super Famicom in Japan, but that didn't stop Sega from going after the North American market, and that's where the Sega Genesis comes from. Now, most of you have already heard of Sega's famous anti-Nintendo advertising campaign, but what you might not remember is how important celebrity name recognition was to Sega's advertising back in the early days. When these ads came out in mid-1990s, Sega's strategy was clear: use names like Tommy Lasorda, Pat Riley, and Arnold Palmer to sell its sports games to fans. In retrospect, it seems that Sega was willing to do anything just to get people to try the games. And so the focus of those old Genesis ads was always on the celebrities. Now, some of these games actually became really popular, like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. But the funny thing about this ad is that this Joe Montana football game didn't actually exist yet and wouldn't be released for more than 6 months. Well, I guess in the world of business, you have to do what you have to do. However, Sega really was walking a thin line here. The company had never established that it could master the North American market. These celebrities were expensive. For example, Joe Montana signed a contract worth over $1 million for using his name. And the biggest problem was that Sega needed to compromise to get that perfect killer app for its new system. This is Trip Hawkins, the CEO at the time of a small company called Electronic Arts. Hawkins was a football fan growing up and was a big fan of Stratomatic's tabletop football game. Hawkins and his company spent years developing John Madden Football, a game that was supposed to be a realistic computer sim of the sport. I don't recommend trying the computer versions of the original Madden Football these days. I mean, they're playable, I guess, but you're going to be disappointed. They were still really primitive, and the game was nowhere near as playable or as interesting as something like XOR NFL Challenge. But the version that they developed for the Genesis is an entirely different story. See, that famous lockout chip that Nintendo had for its console wound up being its undoing. Hawkins and his company simply did not want to play along with Nintendo's game. Instead, Hawkins apparently believed that the Genesis was the way of the future. And to aid him in his negotiations with Sega, he and his team came up with a method to defeat Sega's version of the lockout chip, which gave him the upper hand in negotiations. The threat to make functional unlicensed games for the Genesis got Sega to back down, giving Electronic Arts a discount on licensing. And as a result, John Madden Football was released on the Sega Genesis, complete with the prominent seal of quality on the front. Of course, Sega was working on its own football game at the time, the one with Joe Montana's name and face, but production wasn't exactly going so well. Apparently, the original idea was to make an updated version of Great Football. I honestly have no idea how that was supposed to work. Back in September 1990, GamePro ran this preview of the new Joe Montana Genesis game, claiming that it would have advanced artificial intelligence features. There was also supposed to be strategy sessions at halftime and before and after each game. And most importantly, it was supposed to be released before Christmas. It's almost impossible to see anything in this preview image, though it does look a little like Great Football for the Sega Master System. But then things fell apart. Sega had partnered with a company called Mediagenic to create the Genesis Joe Montana game. Mediagenic was the sports arm of Activision, but it was so poorly managed that it couldn't manage to get even a demo of the game ready. Apparently, part of the problem was that nobody on the team had any experience programming for the Sega Genesis. Now, the interesting thing is that there was a version of Joe Montana Football for the Master System, which looks a lot like that old Great Football game. It's not an awful game, but it's certainly not Tecmo Bowl. Perhaps they were thinking of something like this for the Genesis, though this game really needed a lot of work if it was going to compete with Madden. And so, in a panic, Sega did the unthinkable. It asked Electronic Arts for help. Trip Hawkins and his team came to the rescue, well, sort of. EA built a stripped-down game with fewer plays and options that was still playable. So, the first Joe Montana football game feels and sounds a lot like the first Madden game. There are a few differences, mostly minor. The biggest difference is probably the awkward play calling system and the limited number of plays. But the truth is that these two games were basically the same, and there was no question whose company was really calling the shots. Unfortunately for Sega, though, the Joe Montana game didn't quite hit its deadline. Sega proudly released this ad for its new game, but not until February 1991, far too late for Christmas. The video game magazines weren't shy about reminding Sega about its missed deadline. And there were also those odd details about how the final game looked nothing like the screenshots in the advertisements. Still, Joe Montana Football got generally positive reviews and ratings. In fact, GamePro seems to have loved this game and kindly glossed over the fact that it was basically the same as the first Madden game. And so a crisis was averted. Sega got its game out, though it was a few months late. EA, meanwhile, had saved the day and had made it quite clear that it was the true strength behind the Sega Genesis. Well, Joe Montana 2 went back to the side-to-side perspective, though with a few twists. Honestly, though, this game is a lot worse than the first version. The 1993 Joe Montana game was a major improvement. This is where the franchise really started to develop its own identity. Meanwhile, Madden 92 is an absolutely fantastic game, almost certainly one of the best 16-bit football games around. All of the really annoying things about the first game were fixed. Most importantly, this game plays quickly with fewer of the delays that plagued the first game. And I guess the rest is history. In the end, the EA games dominated the platform, and the story of EA bailing out Sega's in-house football game wound up being kind of a lost piece of video game trivia.